Good afternoon, everybody. I am Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of ASMEA, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you to our webinar series conversations this afternoon, and good morning, actually, where Peter is actually on the West Coast. So good morning to our West Coast listeners and viewers. Um, we have the opportunity of talking to our friend and colleague, Peter Theroux. Peter is a longtime observer, translator, author, analyst, longtime career in national security, and has been a keen observer of the Middle East for many, many years, and a phenomenal writer, author, and novelist. And translator on a great deal of Arab literature. Everything he writes is worth reading. A lot of his summaries have now been coming up with a two-part series of novels that are being published by Tablet, if I'm correct. Peter will correct me if I'm wrong on that. He has been really amongst the many things that he's been diving into is, of course, observing the situation in Iran. He wrote a phenomenal piece for Tablet back in 2024, I believe, about the CIA, the remembering the CIA coup in Iran that never took place. All of you who are longtime members of ASMEA know that we deal a lot with the lost in translation between facts and reality, as far as what is perceived to be happening in higher education and reality on the ground. This is one of the stories and the important parts of history that need to be unpacked well, especially with the current events in Iran, as it relates to Mohammad Mossadegh back in '53, the involvement of American foreign policy as it relates to Iran altogether. And those of you who know a little bit about Operation Ajax, I'm sure that Peter will go into and tackle all of that and to extrapolate and explain what actually took place. Housekeeping wise, Peter will talk for about 25 to 30 minutes. Then we will go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat. So all you got to do is type in your questions and we'll do our best to respond. If we don't, feel free to write us after the webinar and we will do our best to respond in a timely fashion. So really, without further ado, Peter, thank you again for joining us. And the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you very, very much, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Greetings from LA. Thank you for having me, Asaf and company. It was actually 2003 when Tablet published this article of mine about the coup that never was, or actually more accurate would be the coup that was actually done by somebody else. It wasn't the CIA's coup. It was a coup perpetrated by or attempted by Mohammad Mossadegh, the royally appointed prime minister of Iran. He was a peripheral Qajar dynasty royalty or nobility, and famously briefly prime minister of Iran. One of the best accounts, not of our subject today, the coup or non-coup, but one of the best portraits of Mossadegh was written by Vernon Walters, the very, very wise, brilliant linguist and military figure who served as advisor to so many U.S. presidents. He wrote a book full of vignettes called Silent Missions, and he has a fantastic chapter about it's, of course, it's long out of print. You can find it on thrift books, ABE books, or maybe in your local library. He writes so perceptively about the very intelligent, very, very wily Mohammad Mossadegh, who is also an amazing egotist and liar. Anyway, yeah. So the myth is, as we've discussed, as we see online a lot, if you are on social media like X, formerly Twitter, the U.S. committed via the CIA this cardinal sin of overthrowing the first democratically elected prime minister of Iran in the summer of 1953. And the facts are these. I mean, the myth is one thing. He was democratically elected. He was overthrown. He was a hero, a martyr, a Democrat. Well, the facts are that the Shah was, in fact, a weak and rather vacillating leader. He had 10 or 11 prime ministers that he appointed and dismissed in his career as monarch of Iran. He appointed Mohammad Mossadegh per the Constitution of Iran. He considered his options, decided upon Mossadegh, and appointed him. The Majlis, the Parliament of Iran, conducted a straw poll, or a straw vote, as some of the historians have called it, a pro forma exercise where they said, we approve of the Shah's appointment. Mossadegh took power, nationalized the oil industry, made his nephew deputy minister of war, or minister of defense, as he renamed it. He did not have the authority to shut down the parliament. That was the Shah's prerogative. So he conducted an illegal and bizarre electoral exercise with no secret ballot, where you voted yes, shut it down, or no, don't shut it down, in different locations. So it was a fantastic farce of an exercise. It kind of prefigured the Islamic Revolution's vote to be, to the Iranian public decades later, do you want an Islamic Republic? Where there was a red no ballot and a green yes ballot, and under military, with guns pointed at them, Iranians went to the polls and shockingly chose an Islamic Republic. Anyway, the turmoil in Iran was bad. The Shah saw it happen out of the country for part of the time, partially because of the threats of violence. I think he had 2 prime ministers assassinated, and there were threats against him. So he went to Rome and Baghdad to watch from there. Mossadegh lost Tuda, the Communist Party. He lost the mullahs. The Ayatollahs turned against him. The public turned against him. And the British, who had been kicked out with the nationalization of the oil industry, which they had been running with very little local Iranian expertise, with the British gone, the U.S. Stood up. Eisenhower had very little interest. He was fairly hands off, but the CIA people in the time, CIA was a very, very new organization at the time. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years old or something like that. Inherited the British intelligence network, and they weren't able to get a lot done. In the end, the phony, in air quotes, coup, the thing that happened was that the idea the Americans had was stiffen the Shah's spine, telling the very hesitant Shah, look, you have the power to dismiss him, just do it. And the Shah was back and forth on that, but ultimately he wrote 2 royal edicts. One was, I hereby dismiss you, Mohammad Mossadegh, as prime minister, and royal edict number 2, I appoint Ardeshir Zahedi to replace you as prime minister. Easy as pie. So these firmans, as they were called, the royal edicts, were delivered in person to Mossadegh, and he signed, acknowledged receipt, but said, "I'm not obeying them. I'm not going anywhere." So that was the attempted coup. He was dismissed, he was replaced, and he refused to leave power until, within a few days, a mob surrounded his house, and there was violence, and he escaped. He was captured. He was treated well. He was put under house arrest. The Shah came back into the country, and the Ayatollahs welcomed the Shah. So those are the basic facts of the historical episode. Um, what was unfortunate was that Kermit Roosevelt, um, who saw this as a huge and tremendous victory, put the agency and, more importantly, himself at the center of all of this action. Um, the CIA did two things, working with the U.S. Embassy. They persuaded the Shah to bite the bullet and fire the guy, which he did. And secondly, they took copies of the royal edicts and published them in a paper. Now, the CIA covert actions, influence operations in later decades would call that press placements. You put something in the press to highlight or mislead or undermine somebody, and that's an act of espionage. It's a covert action, but this wasn't even that. It was just taking a known public fact, an act by a government, which issued documents, and publishing the documents. So that was the extent of what Roosevelt did. But he not only dressed this up as his brainstorm and his genius, he really hurt his government and his country by misleading the world via all of this chest pounding to make it sound like the Americans did this, and this wasn't an internal, a 99.9 internal Iranian affair. He published his book about it right at the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and so everybody, maliciously or naively, bought it and said, okay, well, the CIA installed the Shah. No, they didn't install him. He was Shah. He never abdicated. Just because, our presidents leave the country all the time, that doesn't mean they're not president. So the coup was not a coup. The United States did not restore the Shah to power, let alone install him as the Iranian king. And the misinformation, I highlighted quite a lot of it in that tablet article, and thank you for highlighting that. But the article would have had to be a book, and a pretty long one, to cover all of the damage, the misinformation, the blind repetition of this myth. And a few days back, there was a website where John Alter, well-known journalist, interviewed Tim Weiner. Is it Tim, I think, who had written Legacy of Ashes and has a new book out. And here you have Ivy League educated, high-profile people. Weiner has a brand new book out about the CIA, making the most ludicrous and completely false claims about current and former U.S.-Iranian relations, and it's utterly shameful. Weiner got the ear of a dozen or more former CIA officials, very, very tellingly, all ones whose clearances were pulled, which is an action that isn't taken lightly. The agency was bloated and full of people who have their clearances, top secret clearances, pulled because they are just the kind of people who go running to the likes of that author as soon as they're fired to tell their stories and mislead and spin their understanding of what's right and wrong with the world. So I will one last detail, and I'm happy to turn this into more of a dialogue, Asaf. One thing that did not make it into my article, which was running long for the tablet editors, though they edited and fact checked it very beautifully. I had a section at the end about the Mohammad Mossadegh's epilogue in Iran. He died and under very very benign house arrest. He was again he was from a royal family, a very rich and prosperous family. He had visitors. He lived a quiet, contemplative life. He was extremely well treated. Um, so died, and then with the advent of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, uh, there were people running the government who thought very highly of him. We're talking about Shapur Bakhtiar and Mahdi Bazargan, uh, the latter of whom succeeded the former as prime minister of Iran, Bakhtiar being the very last of the Shah's prime ministers, and Bazargan, the very ill-fated first prime minister under Ruhollah Khomeini. So one of the first things they did was choose one of the largest boulevards in central downtown Tehran and rename it Mohammad Mossadegh Street. That didn't last very long. This was something I wrote about because while Mossadegh was very undemocratic, he talked a good game about democracy, but he governed as a despot, shut down the parliament, gave himself emergency powers. If I didn't mention, also shut down the Supreme Court lest they rule against him. Refused to step down when he was fired, and so on. The image remained sentimentally. He was a little old man, bald, with a very famous prominent nose. He was photographed, from his bed, giving orders in his pajamas. He's a nice grandfatherly old guy. He very famously promoted a policeman who had given a traffic ticket to his daughter. When his daughter went to him and said, this cop gave me a ticket. I told him, don't you know who I am? You have to love him a little bit for this. He said, you're a citizen like anybody else. And he promoted the guy and said, good for you. So he had a big street named after him and quite a lot of sentimentality surrounding his reputation. In no time at all, Khomeini stripped that street of his name. And because he was secular, the Qom, the city of Qom, the shrine city and seminary city, and the mullahs generally, the ayatollahs hated him. And Khomeini was one of those who hated Mossadegh. So it was an early straw in the wind that this secular revolution against the Shah was very quickly hijacked to be a theological Islamic one. And there were moves subsequently to name a street after Mossadegh as to honor him somehow. And so in a far more remote part of Tehran, they did indeed rename a much humbler street for Mossadegh. And you can probably find it on Google Earth. And I actually got an image of it, which showed one of the walls on Mossadegh Street in a remote part of Tehran, not only covered with graffiti, but with a plaque or kind of a posted notice: get English lessons, learn English, and get ahead, adorned with a little United States flag. So that is how Mossadegh Street looks, or at least looked at that time of writing 2 or 3 years back. So his reputation in Iran has suffered, but with this incredible mythology, it's just so easy to say. The U.S. overthrew the only democratically elected government of Iran, and that's why everybody hates us. In his really, really awful book, All the Shah's Men, Kinzer, I referenced this in my article, writes about how this led straight to September 11th. The United States, as the heavy, as the anti-democratic, great Satan, overthrew the wonderful democratic government and installed the Shah, and the hatred lit the fuse that took down the twin towers and hit the Pentagon. And my gosh, how much mischief has come from this vile myth. It's just terrible.
Oh, good, Peter. Well, thank you for all of that. I have many questions, and I'm sure Alex does as well. And thank you for unpacking all of that. We talk a lot about living in the age of infotainment and lost in translation. And you hit obviously, a good segue to your last point about Kinzer's book and the connection. And so. You've done a phenomenal job, really, setting the historical record straight. And we know, that today we're even more so shaped by all the social media and everything else that's going around. So take it one step further. How is this story, which has become a kind of a canard in this whole story as far as American foreign policy in Iran, is still now shaping American foreign policy in the Middle East. And you don't have to get too political, but really also affecting really the attitudes that we're talking about the current war in Iran as a result of what happened in 53, and given the amount of information that's misinformation that's out there, as it relates to dealing with Iran, when there's so much talk now about, what does reform look like, what do changes look like, and trying to install a different kind of Iran post the war. So if you don't mind going a little bit into that, that'll be great.
Well, yeah, the it has cast a shadow over uh, Epic Fury, the current military operation that's been ongoing for, I guess, a couple of weeks or so. Um, it has twisted it because, of course, what we have is a regime that's very, very much unlike the relatively weak um, uh, Iranian state of the 1950s, which had been heard and intimidated by the Russians, by the British, and so on, had lost territory to Azerbaijan, to Soviet Russia, and even to Afghanistan in the case of Herat. We have a regime that has committed acts of war against the United States, starting with November 1979, taking over the U.S. embassy, holding our diplomats hostage for 444 days, supporting very, very robustly supporting terrorist proxies as an outer line of defense, not only because they hate Jews, they hate Israel, they hate their Arab neighbors, and they hate us, but as to create a near abroad so that anyone coming after Iran will get bogged down in that big moat of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, especially Hezbollah, the former horrible Ba'athist Assad regime in Syria, um, and then moving along to the creation of EFPs, explosively formed penetrators, that were used to kill more than 600 Americans in Iraq. This was all murderous mischief, and it was acts of war. And the U.S. kept stretching out its hand, and this was impossible because you have a psychopathic regime. So very, very belatedly, after decades of dialogue or efforts at dialogue, the U.S. Under the 47th president reached a point where the Iranians were boasting to Witkoff and I guess Kushner that they had enough fissile material for 11 bombs. Ha ha ha. And clearly trying to get, planning to have a nuclear weapons program, which is like about the 44th red line in a row that they had crossed. So, working with the Israelis, the U.S., I think, took a rational but violent decision to erase that capability and to act retributively against the Iranian government, which has been asking for this for decades. So you have the Operation Ajax, TP Ajax as it was known, The plan to bolster the Shah's rule against his rogue prime minister in 1953. You have that still casting a shadow because you have the United States as the bully and Tehran as the victim, which is the reverse, which is the mirror opposite of the case. And what we haven't really addressed here is the way the Iranian regime has behaved toward its people. It has always been murderous when not actually genocidal against its own people. One of the things that stands out is because I mentioned this a little bit because it's a known fact in geopolitics. If you want to know, how far you can trust a government, how they're going to behave toward you in the geopolitical world, look how they treat their people. Well, after, of course, you have this group in Iran, the Mujahideen Khalq. They've been on and off the U.S. terrorism list. They're really not good actors. You had thousands of them imprisoned and sentenced to various prison sentences in the 1980s. When the Iran-Iraq war ended in the late 1980s, you can argue who lost. I mean, Iran. It was a bloody draw in a lot of ways, but Iran failed to get its objectives. They couldn't get the UN to condemn Iraq as the aggressor, but they signed a peace with a government they said was straight from Satan, and feeling weak and definitely feeling that he had lost, Ruhollah Khomeini, who had only weeks to live or a few months to live at the time, ordered the execution of all of those Mujahideen Khalq prisoners. I think there were around 8,000 of them. Maybe some of maybe you or some of your listeners can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think I am. They were hanged by the dozens and dozens over 24 hours as the days went on. This was a massacre and an atrocity, and a sign that yes, this is a government that would murder its own citizens for demonstrating, as we've seen in the last 2 weeks. And so the U.S. and Israel acted not only, I think, out of a moral and strategic sense, but also in a practical sense. They're the only governments that can do this. I mean, the Europeans are bystanders. China and Russia are bystanders. You have to have no gift of Schadenfreude to see everybody leave Iran isolated. The Russians, who were buying their drones to hit Ukraine, China, who consumed their oil, everyone stepped back from them. Of course, the Assads fled to Moscow, one of my favorite historical events I'm glad I lived to see. Hezbollah was largely smashed and its leadership killed. Hamas and PIJ have been kind of sitting on their hands. But again, for people who look favorably upon the Islamic Republic regime or who hate the United States, they have this one thing in their hip pocket, which is that America started all this by overthrowing a government. No, 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 no.
Great, thank you. And thank you for all the very important details, which again are critical all around. Alex, I know you have questions as well, and we also have questions from the audience, so I'm going to turn it over
Sure.
to you as well.
Well, thanks. First of all, thanks very much for the discussion, for being here. Um, I want to shift focus, at least very briefly, to one of our somebody we were talking about before going on the air, and the phenomenon of um, CIA memoirs,
Uh,
which influence history, you might say. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. Writing this very influential, very self-serving, very misleading memoir. And there are lots of other, particularly Middle East CIA Middle East hands, about whom things have been written. Um, Kim's cousin Archie Roosevelt, Miles Copeland, um, father of Stuart Copeland, the drummer for the Police, among other things. And the list of these memoirs just goes goes on and on. And there's a parallel historical literature written by people like Hugh Wilford, um, delving into both the memoirs and the documentary evidence to prove the effectiveness and the nefarious intention of CIA operations around the world, but with particular emphasis on the Middle East. Um, in the end, is this story of the coup a kind of own goal, or is it, in a way, a PR coup for the agency, um, which is effective everywhere, doing all sorts of things? Um,
Well, Kim Roosevelt's book, Own Goal, is an absolutely beautiful term for it. Yeah, it was a misleading and ludicrous book published at exactly the wrong uh, time. And as we've discussed, and as I mentioned in the tablet article we've been referencing, um, people who think the CIA is an evil and disgusting, a violent and terrible organization, and that Kermit Roosevelt did this terrible act of overthrowing a democratically elected government, somehow thinks he is an absolutely angel who tells only the truth. They don't read his book and say, well, this book was written by a jerk. Somehow, because it fits their narrative, somehow he is incapable of fabricating, embellishing, or lying. He is telling the absolute gospel truth on every page of that stupid thing. Um, so uh, it's an own goal, and uh, so okay, I have to. I wrote a little book, partially getting into a little bit of my agency career. I should mention it went through editorial review, pre-publication review, called In Obscura. It's the second part of that book that I'm writing now, which when you join the CIA or any such intelligence agency in our government, you sign an agreement that says it's a secrecy agreement, which is for life, not for the period of your employment. You're not going to disclose secrets. You're not going to put sensitive information out of channels, is the term of art. And you must submit anything you write, if other than your mother's, banana bread recipe, must go to through editorial review, and they can redact. I really wish fewer people would do this. In my own defense, my book was very, very short, very, very accurate, and it was duly reviewed. They made some redactions I didn't love very much, but I submitted to them. I removed the language. Some authors, when they do that, they keep the same structure, they keep the language in, but they black it out so dramatically see the cool stuff they wouldn't let me share with you. Aren't I daring? Aren't I great? And aren't they mean? So yeah, way too many of these memoirs are published. The best ones don't publish at all, or they're very careful. Another footnote, one of nothing to do with Iran, an absolute exemplar of how this should be done is Jean Vertefeuille's book about Aldrich Ames. She was one of these little old lady in tennis shoes who worked in the DO, the Department of the Directorate of Operations, and it has treason in the title. I didn't think I was going to mention this. It's about Aldrich Ames. Vertefeuille, green leaves in French, is her name. She co-wrote it. She wrote she was a brilliant spy, a brilliant counterintelligence officer, and she wrote this book, and it's you absolutely cannot put it down. You can't remember the title, also, unfortunately, sometimes. But Circle of Treason, maybe it's called Circle of Treason, and it went through review. She writes in her preface. She's very fussy and snarky about why they removed some of the language, but that's how it's done. You play by the rules. You're not partisan. You're not emotional. You don't stab your country or your former agency in the back. And lastly, the worst, if Jean Vertefroy's book is the best example, the worst, which does touch on Iran and Hezbollah in the Middle East, is John Brennan's memoir Undaunted. If you look at the Tablet website, you can find my review of that book. It's a very profoundly stupid book. I'll leave that there. But yeah, people have a chance to publish. They can't resist it. The best spies retire and train dogs and play golf or do charity work or whatever, and don't talk about it anymore.
Great. Alex, you have a follow-up, or do you want to
I
go
have
to?
many follow-up questions, but
Okay,
let's go to
so
the
yeah,
audience.
we have a few questions here in the audience, so let's try to do that. And of course they're not short questions. Suzanne, I'm gonna have you go to the audience, and let's start with our friend Larry.
Okay. The first question that we have for you, Peter, is from Professor Larry Simpson, and he asks, can you elaborate a bit on the role that Khomeini's predecessors, the Ayatollahs Kashani and Behbahani, played in Mossadegh's overthrow?
The short answer is no, because that's not particularly my area of expertise. However, you can I would refer you to my article, not just to what I wrote, but to the books I cited. There are really very solid scholars of the Iranian of the Shia religious establishment, like Ervand Abrahamian, Darius Bayandor, um, uh, several more whom I cite in the article. And there is no question that they represented really centuries of the traditional quietist position of the Shia clergy, which is that they didn't get involved in politics. They liked to have the ear of the Shah. It did the Shah credit to be seen with them and listening to them. And yeah, so they were a quietist group. They saw Mossadegh as an they came to see Mossadegh as an adversary. Kashani preeminently, and Ayatollah Behbahani, and others. They very publicly welcomed the Shah back when he came in, but for the inside baseball of the politics and theology, and how they went to daggers drawn with the deposed Mossadegh. That isn't really my area, but there are excellent sources. You'll find them in 2 seconds in my article.
Great. We have the article, I believe, on our website too, for those who are interested. Okay, we have another question here from Professor Andrew Kurt. It's kind of a long question, but he thanks you for the article. He has shared it with his students, and he says that he generally agrees with your rejection of the label, in quotes, US coup. It was instead a legal dismissal by the Shah, and the US didn't and couldn't actually carry it out. But Professor Kurt writes, the archival record makes it abundantly clear the CIA was heavily involved by extensive plan. Don't we risk a whitewash in the other direction by disacknowledging the American role that included heavy propaganda, Operation Bedam, money for street protest managers, and literally preparing the Furmans?
Yeah, the Firmans, the royal edicts. Yes. Okay. I'm going to be very careful here, and I'm going to name another book for a reference book for people to read, specifically for this professor and his students. The British and the Americans Yes, they did have plans. They had a covert action budget. They were interested in propaganda. You could famously rent a mob in Tehran, but you didn't really have to pay for it. I mean, Tuda, the Communist Party, could put hundreds of thousands of people in the street. As cited in my article, Ray Takei mentioned. Now, don't forget that in a phrase that occurs in the book, Garden of the Brave in War, about pre-revolutionary Iran, the place was as crooked as a barrel of snakes. Takei wrote, and Abrahamian, with different words, says that Mossadegh's downfall was the worst kept secret in Iran. He had alienated everyone. The pro Shah people, the true Democrats, the public, with his messing up the oil sector, shutting down democratic institutions in the country, ruling like an autocrat, appointing family members in government, refusing to step down when he was ordered. So I concur. Yes, the U.S. had a lot of plans, and you could characterize them as nefarious in the sense that they were aimed at interfering in the internal affairs of a foreign country. The Shah, they had the ear of the Shah in the wording of the Firmans. Now, again, so I appreciate this professor's sense of nuance, and we do not want a whitewash in the opposite direction. I refer you here to two books. One that I just promised, which is The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran by Alex Vatanka, who is, I think, the most unbiased and the best informed commentator on Iran. His book, The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, I use the term inside baseball, is a brilliant, well-informed book on exactly that topic. And it relies on hundreds of sources we don't have access to, because he's a Persian speaker and he had access to great information. The second one I mentioned, Darius Bayandor, who I don't know if he's still alive. He lived in Switzerland. He wrote a book called it's about the CIA and Iran. He is very, very measured, and he has all the documents. Like Vatanka, he has Iranian roots, and he is a wise and careful observer. He comes to the same conclusion I did in my article, and I was very happy to cite his very small, very readable book. He comes to the conclusion that the Shah legally dismissed Mossadegh, legally appointed his successor, Zahedi, but he says it's like at the end of a wording of a very careful Supreme Court decision. He says this was definitely tainted by illicit complicity with a foreign power. So he ends up just about where I did, but whereas I think governments consult with and confer with and work with foreign stronger powers all the time. I look at it more positively, and Bayandor kind of says, at the end of the day, I don't like this. One thing, a good question for a class would be, what were the alternatives? You have the Shah in the position he was in. You have a stubborn, anti-democratic prime minister who starts to behave like a despot. This affects countries, neighboring countries, and countries like the United States and Britain. Britain was behaving very imperially. I mean, I think they behaved a lot worse than the United States. They didn't have the ability to influence events, though. So a good exercise would be, what were the alternatives for the Shah, for his allies, and for the internal Iranian government, which was being shut down by Mossadegh. They used the Iranian constitution as their guide. So again, it's a good exercise. What were the alternative outcomes or actions here?
Great. Suzanne?
Yes, thank you, Peter. Okay, so we have a question here from Professor Emmanuel Abua, and he writes, given the role of the CIA and the US government in interventions in parts of the world where they disagreed with sitting governments and their policies, and the vexed question of nationalization, is it inconceivable that the CIA played no part in the overthrow of Mossadegh? Is insisting the Iranian public at the time to rise up against the prime minister not an act of at least passive coup?
He was not overthrown. Mohammad Mossadegh was not overthrown. He was dismissed from his job. And as referenced in some of the good histories of Iran that I mentioned, yeah, there were mobs. There were riots. There were mobs. Were they rented? Were they real? Were there hidden hands behind it? Some of that is still secret. So I'm going to mention another name here of a reliable person who's a commentator, and you can also find him on social media. So the TP Ajax operational plan, the CIA's plan for operations in Iran at the time, is still heavily redacted. I've seen, bless you, I've read, like anybody who studies this period in Iran, I've read the redacted version. The former, I think I can say this, I don't think this is classified anymore, the former head of the Iran department at the CIA, whom I know, who's retired now, had the full unredacted TP Ajax document in his desk at CIA headquarters. He knew it intimately. He knew every unredacted line of it. That's in that vast area of information that is beyond top secret. It is compartmented. It is operational. It is black. It's in restricted channels, as they're called. He had access to that full document, and he agrees with my so I don't have access to all of that. He did, and he comes down on my side of this argument. His name is Norman Rule, Roule, and he's an active as a commentator. You can probably find him on YouTube. You can definitely find him on X, formerly Twitter. And so I would just throw that out there. Some things are still not public, and some things are still not known to me. But Mossadegh was not overthrown.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another question here, and they write, does it matter if Mossadegh was removed from an overthrow, dismissed by the Shah, or put in house arrest? Regardless of the method, such interest and intent by Kim Roosevelt, Dulles Brothers, etc., to remove Mossadegh and undo the oil nationalization was effectively attained. In that context, does saying the CIA did not interfere as effectively as previously assumed, does that get the MI6 also off the hook?
Wow, what an elaborately constructed question. Bravo. It's an intelligent question. Thank you. Get the MI6 off the hook. I guess short answer, yes. The British were feckless. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, their behavior was pretty outrageous. The United States was an upstart at the time. They were extremely arrogant in their treatment of all the Iranians, from the Shah down to the Iranian workers who worked for the Anglo oil company, which became NIOC, the National Iranian Oil Company. They were forced out of the country. Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry. It was absolutely pointless. They didn't have the expertise to run it. As mentioned in my article, oil production in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and elsewhere, uh, was vastly increased. So it made it completely marginalized the Iranian oil sector. So yeah, the British, so they turned over their spy network to the then, sort of nascent CIA. They got out of the country. They were lobbying Eisenhower to be far more intrusive to recover their economic interests in Iran. And Eisenhower wouldn't play along. He really didn't. This was not front and center for him, and he didn't want to invest a lot in it. He bucked everything down to the Dulles brothers and to Roosevelt. So MI6 is kind of off the hook, but it doesn't mean they were good actors here.
Okay, thank you. Good answer. Okay, we have a follow-up question from Andrew Kurt, Professor Andrew Kurt. And he writes, I've always had a hard time balancing US action against the threat of Soviet takeover of Iran, a reality in spite of Ervan Abrahamian's dismissal and a whole trail of propaganda, outright deception, and later suppression of documents. Extremely hesitant and highly redacted releases in 1989 and 2017. Apart from the leak in 2000 of Donald Wilbur's 1954 After Action report, this doesn't look so good, I've always thought. What's your honest take on this?
This being the perception that Soviet Russia or that Russia could take over Iran and the resulting U.S. propaganda or operational plans to thwart it. Do I understand that correctly, do you think?
Yes.
Yes, he writes yes.
Okay, there I would refer you again to Alex Vatanka's writings. Somebody who also knows about this is an Iranian, I don't know if he's Iranian American, but he lives in the United States, I think in New York. Arash Azizi. He wrote a book about Qasem Soleimani, which also I reviewed for Tablet. He has a leftist take on things. Now, that piece of geopolitics of Tehran versus Moscow and the Western piece of it, including the United States, is not particularly my field. Judging from the way that Professor Kurtz constructed that question, he probably knows more about it than I do. Nikita Khrushchev famously said that when the Shah was still in power, and obviously when he was still in power, Khrushchev, that Iran is a rotten apple waiting to fall into our hands. Well, it didn't quite fall into Russia's hands, although the Islamic Republic would cultivate Russia as a very, very close ally. I don't want to turn into Thomas Friedman here, just citing taxi drivers when I'm being asked thoughtful questions by professors. But yes, I live in LA, and yes, you get Persian taxi drivers. There was one time when a taxi driver was ranting about the Qajars and some of the former Shahs and how they ceded land to Russia, the Treaty of Turkmenchai. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. And so there is a long history, a very, very long history, way predating, forget Kim Roosevelt, predating the existence of the United States. Russia and Persia, Russia and Iran, recurring Russian ambitions to include territorial ambitions. It's not my field. I appreciate the question, though. And I refer you to Vatanka, to Azizi, and obviously that's something where Ervan Abrahamian is strong too.
Great. Peter, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us and for waking up this early in the morning. I know LA time, so I appreciate you taking the time. But really, it's been phenomenal to hear you and to analyze all these topics and this significant period, which obviously has been reverberating for all these years and is clearly impacting American foreign policy to this very day. So it's really, I appreciate you coming and talk to us. Hope you can come back also to talk about the new part two of the book in Obscura, so we can talk about your latest work. And of course, I will make a public plea that I hope to see you in person in Washington in November. And we'd love to have you in person as always, and to unearth all these topics and to tackle them as you do so well. As always, I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. And of course, I know there's some leftover questions, so of course, feel free to email us after the webinar. And as always, be on the lookout for future webinars, which will be coming out in the next week or so, and we'll take it from there. So, hope everybody has a good day. Everybody stay safe. Peter, have a good day.
Thank you.
Now you're entitled to your cup of coffee.
Thank you. Have a good day. I appreciate the time and the great questions.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.